April 1st, 1945, Defensive Position 73, Shuri Line, Okinawa. The world is made of damp soil and shadow. For Private First Class Kaito Tanaka, of the Imperial Japanese Army's 24th Division, this subterranean world has become his entire existence. The air in the bunker is thick with the scent of wet clay, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of rifle oil. Above, 30 feet of rock and earth separate his 5-man machine gun team from the pre-dawn sky. But it doesn't feel like enough. His fingers, raw and calloused, trace the embroidery on a small silk pouch, an omamori, a good luck charm from the shrine near his home in Kagoshima. His mother had pressed it into his hand at the train station, her face a mask of stoic resolve that barely concealed her terror. "Come back," her eyes had said, even as her lips spoke of honor and duty to the emperor. Inside the bunker, that memory is the only warmth. For days, the island of Okinawa has been holding its breath. Kaito and the men of the 32nd Army have listened to the drone of distant American aircraft and watched the sea beyond the ridges fill with a gray forest of steel masts. More ships than any of them had ever imagined possible. They are ghosts on the horizon, a silent, menacing promise. The veterans who survived Palayu and Iwo Jima have told stories, whispering of an enemy that does not fight, but simply erases the ground before them. They speak of the Tetsu no Amifuri, the rain of steel. A low primordial vibration begins to travel through the earth, a deep thrum that is felt more than heard. It is not the familiar shudder of an earthquake. This is something else, something methodical, organized. The water in the canteens ripples. A loose pebble skitters from a ledge. Kaito's comrades stop their hushed conversations, their eyes wide in the gloom of the single lantern. They look at one another, then instinctively towards the reinforced entrance of their cave. The silence that follows the vibration is the most terrifying sound of all. It is the silence of a colossal machine drawing a breath. Out on the dark water, the silhouettes of American battleships, Tennessee, Nevada, New Mexico, are turning their immense flanks toward the shore. In their cavernous magazines, men are moving with a purpose that is both human and mechanical, hoisting projectiles the size of small automobiles into the breeches of their 14-inch guns. This is not the beginning of a battle. It is the beginning of a geological event, a man-made apocalypse aimed at this very rock. Kaito Tanaka clutches his omamori, but he knows with a cold certainty that settles deep in his gut that no charm can protect him from what is about to happen. The world is about to be unmade. The battle for Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, was to be the final bloody act in the Pacific War's island-hopping campaign. For the Allies, the island was a critical strategic objective, a deep-water anchorage and multiple airfields just 340 miles from mainland Japan, the perfect staging ground for the planned invasion, Operation Downfall. For this purpose, the United States had assembled the most powerful naval armada in the history of warfare. Under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, the U.S. Fifth Fleet comprised over 1,500 vessels, including 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, 200 destroyers, and hundreds of support craft. At the core of this force was the Gunfire and Covering Force, Task Force 54, a floating arsenal of unprecedented destructive power. This was the sledgehammer intended to shatter the Japanese defenses. It included 10 older battleships, many of them resurrected from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, their vintage hulls now bristling with modern radar and fire control systems. They were joined by 11 cruisers and dozens of destroyers. Their sole purpose in the opening phase of the battle was to deliver naval gunfire support, or NGS. The doctrine of NGS had been brutally refined in the crucible of previous amphibious assaults. At Tarawa, insufficient bombardment had led to a massacre of Marines on the beaches. At Iwo Jima, the bombardment was more intense, but still failed to neutralize the deeply entrenched Japanese defenders. Okinawa was to be different. The plan was not merely to harass or suppress the enemy, but to systematically annihilate them. For 7 days leading up to the main landing on April 1st, a relentless preliminary bombardment would pound the island. On L-Day itself, the full fury of the fleet would be unleashed. The targets were meticulously plotted on gridded maps. Fire control officers aboard the capital ships had a god's eye view, coordinating a symphony of destruction. The 16-inch Mark 7 guns of the newer fast battleships and the 14-inch guns of the older standards could hurl armor-piercing, AP shells weighing over 700 pounds, designed to smash through concrete fortifications, or high-capacity body shells weighing 900 pounds, which would detonate with a concussive blast and a storm of shrapnel that could clear acres of land in an instant. Cruisers with their 8-inch and 6-inch guns would target secondary positions, while the nimble destroyers with their rapid-firing 5-inch guns would provide a continuous rolling barrage, a curtain of explosions that would walk just ahead of the advancing infantry. It was a strategy born of industrial might, a mathematical equation where victory was measured in tons of high explosives per square yard. Facing this floating apocalypse was the Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, comprising roughly 110,000 men, including the elite 24th Division and 62nd Division, and supplemented by thousands of Okinawan conscripts. This was a formidable force. Ushijima and his brilliant chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, knew they could not defeat the American fleet. Their strategy was not to win, but to bleed, to inflict such horrific casualties on the invaders that America would lose its will to demand unconditional surrender. Learning from past defeats, Ushijima abandoned the futile defense of the beaches. Instead, he implemented a defense in depth, conceding the initial landings to draw the Americans into a killing ground. The southern third of Okinawa was transformed into a subterranean fortress. Utilizing the island's rugged coral limestone terrain, his engineers had constructed a labyrinthine network of defenses centered on a series of fortified ridges known as the Shuri Line. This was not a simple line of trenches, but an interconnected web of caves, machine gun nests, hidden artillery positions, and concrete pillboxes, all with interlocking fields of fire. Tunnels connected reverse-slope defenses, allowing troops to weather the initial bombardment and emerge to attack the Americans from unexpected directions. General Ushijima was confident. His men were well-trained, disciplined, and imbued with the warrior code of Bushido. They were prepared for Gyokusai, to fight to the last man. They had stockpiled ammunition and food for a protracted siege. They had studied American tactics. They knew the bombardment was coming. They believed their deep fortifications, hewn from the living rock of Okinawa, would protect them from the storm. They would endure the steel rain, and when it passed, they would rise from the earth and unleash hell upon the American infantry. They were an immovable object, dug into the heart of their homeland, waiting for the unstoppable force. Inside Defensive Position 73, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of a tomb. The air was cool and stale. Kaito Tanaka ran a piece of oiled cloth over the bolt of his Arisaka Type 99 rifle for the 10th time. The action was smooth, familiar, a small anchor of sanity in the encroaching madness. His duty was to lay down suppressing fire from the narrow aperture that overlooked a gully, part of a carefully planned kill zone. He and his team had practiced it for weeks, until the movements were second nature. They were all young. The squad leader, Sergeant Watanabe, was a stern farmer from Hokkaido who had fought in Manchuria. He was the only one among them who had truly seen combat, and his silence was more unsettling than any nervous chatter. The others were like Kaito, students, fishermen, shopkeepers' sons, their civilian lives shed like a useless skin. Now they were soldiers of the Emperor. Their training had been brutal, designed to strip away individuality and forge a collective will. They had rehearsed bayonet charges against straw dummies, chanting Banzai, until their throats were raw. They had memorized the weak points of the American M4 Sherman tank. They had been lectured endlessly on the divine destiny of Japan and the dishonor of surrender. Death in battle, they were taught, was not an end but a glorious purification, a transformation into a guardian spirit for the nation. Kaito had tried to believe it. He had repeated the oaths and sung the patriotic songs, but in the quiet moments, in the suffocating darkness of the bunker, the teachings of the drill sergeants faded, and the simple human fear remained. He did not fear a clean death from a bullet or a bayonet. He feared the unknown. He feared the stories of the steel rain. The men spoke in low tones, their conversation circling the inevitable. They talked about the food rations, the surprising sweetness of the American cigarettes found on a downed pilot, the letters they hoped to write but never would. No one spoke of home directly, it was too painful. But it was there, in the quiet sighs, in the way a man would stare at a photograph for just a moment too long before tucking it away. They were trying to hold on to the people they had been, even as the army demanded they become something else. The waiting was an exquisite form of torture. For days they had existed in this state of suspended animation. They would sleep in shifts, but it was not true rest. It was a fitful state of anxiety, punctuated by the distant, deep-throated crump of a naval gun testing its range, or the shriek of a lone fighter plane overhead. Every sound was a potential harbinger of the end. Their senses were stretched to the breaking point. They felt like actors on a stage, waiting for a curtain to rise on a play whose final bloody act had already been written. Sergeant Watanabe passed around small cups of cold sake. It was a ceremonial gesture, the drink of samurai before a final desperate charge. "For the Emperor," he said, his voice flat. They drank. The liquid burned a path down Kaido's throat. He looked at the faces of the men around him, illuminated by the flickering lantern. They were no longer boys. Their youth had been baked out of them by the sun and the fear. They were ghosts, haunting their own graves before they were even dead. Kaido placed his empty cup down. The vibration in the earth was growing stronger now. The wait was almost over. Aboard the battleship USS Tennessee, thousands of yards off the coast of Okinawa, the atmosphere was one of cool, detached professionalism. In the ship's Combat Information Center, CIC, a maze of radar screens and plotting tables glowed in the dim blue light. Here, the island of Okinawa was not a place of hills, villages, and ancient tombs. It was a grid, a mathematical problem to be solved. A young officer, Lieutenant Miller, stood over the main plotting table, a transparent overlay showing the day's fire plan. Each red circle represented a known or suspected Japanese position, an artillery battery, a command bunker, a trench network. Each was designated a target number. His job, and the job of the men around him, was to translate those numbers into a precise ballet of death. The U.S. Navy had immense confidence in its material and technical superiority. They had the bigger guns, the endless supply of shells, and the advanced fire control systems to deliver them with terrifying accuracy. The Mark 8 fire control computers were analog marvels, calculating shell trajectory by factoring in ship's speed, roll and pitch, wind velocity, and even the curvature of the Earth and the Coriolis effect. Spotter planes circled high above the island, their pilots calmly radioing back corrections. Target 5A 200 yards over. Drop 100, left 50, fire for effect. The American expectation was that this overwhelming firepower could physically dismantle the Japanese defenses. The logic was simple and brutal. If a machine gun is in a concrete pillbox, a 14-inch high-capacity shell will obliterate the pillbox. If artillery is hidden in a cave, an armor-piercing shell will collapse the cave. The goal was to pulverize the Shuri line, to churn the earth so thoroughly that the defenders would be either killed, buried, or rendered combat ineffective by the time the first wave of Marines and soldiers from the U.S. 10th Army hit the beaches. There was also a psychological component to the plan. The planners in Pearl Harbor understood that they were fighting an enemy with a unique, almost fanatical devotion to their cause. The hope was that a bombardment of this magnitude, a level of violence no army in history had ever endured, would break that spirit. It was meant to be a demonstration of America's industrial omnipotence, a message written in high explosives across the face of the island. Resistance is futile. You cannot win. We can do this forever. To the gun crews sweating in the turrets of the Tennessee, the enemy was abstract. They worked with a rhythmic mechanical efficiency honed by years of training. The commands echoed through the steel chambers. Load AP, 6,000 yards, full charge. The massive shell and bags of cordite propellant were rammed home. The breech block would slam shut with a resounding clang. And then, with the shriek of a siren and the deep clang of a firing gong, the turret would unleash a force equivalent to a freight train hitting a brick wall. The ship itself would shudder, pushed sideways in the water by the sheer recoil. For the men inside, it was a familiar, exhilarating violence. They felt the power, but they were insulated from its horrifying effect. They were technicians in the vast factory of war, and their product was destruction, delivered with cold precision to a set of coordinates on a map. They expected to crush the enemy. They had no way of knowing they were about to crush the very sanity of the men huddled in the earth below. 6:05 hours. The horizon ignites. It doesn't begin with a single gunshot, but with a silent, rippling flash that illuminates the underbellies of the clouds miles out to sea. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there is only this visual spectacle. Then the sound arrives, a single, continuous, deafening roar as hundreds of naval guns, from the colossal 16-inch behemoths to the nimble 5-inchers, open fire in unison. For Kaido Tanaka and the men in position 73, the world simply ceases to exist. The sound is not something they hear with their ears. It is a physical force that enters their bodies, vibrating through their bones, teeth, and organs. It is the sound of the sky being torn apart. The first shells arrive. The impacts are not the sharp cracks of artillery they were trained for. These are cataclysms. A 14-inch shell from the USS Nevada strikes the ridge 100 meters away. The explosion is a blinding white flash, followed by a shockwave that slams into their bunker entrance like an invisible fist. The timber supports groan and splinter. A torrent of dirt and rock fragments showers down from the ceiling. The lantern swings wildly, casting lurching shadows, and then extinguishes, plunging them into absolute roaring darkness. Panic erupts. Men are screaming, but their voices are swallowed by the maelstrom outside. Kaito is thrown against the earthen wall, the breath knocked from his lungs. His ears are ringing, a high-pitched metallic whine that drowns out everything else. He feels a sticky wetness on his cheek and realizes his nose is bleeding from the sheer concussive pressure. Outside, the serene Okinawan landscape is being systematically unmade. The rolling barrage from the destroyers chews through the vegetation, turning green hillsides into brown, smoking wounds. Trees, some centuries old, are vaporized in an instant or tossed into the air like matchsticks. The heavier shells from the battleships and cruisers land with the force of small earthquakes. They don't just create craters, they resculpt the terrain. A small hill is flattened, a ravine is widened. Ancient Okinawan tombs, used by the Japanese as defensive positions, are shattered, their stone walls pulverized into dust. From the fleet's perspective, it is a scene of awesome, terrible beauty. The great ships are wreathed in smoke, their main batteries firing in thunderous broadsides. The sea around them is churned white by their recoil. Shells arc gracefully into the sky, visible for a moment as dark specks against the gray dawn before descending upon the unseen island. The systematic destruction continues, relentless and methodical. Fire missions are called in, targets are shifted. A spotter plane sees movement near a ridge. Fire mission Grid 47 Baker. All ships, fire for effect. Within minutes, that grid square ceases to be a viable part of the planet's surface, buried under tons of high explosive. Inside the bunker, time loses all meaning. The bombardment is not a sequence of events. It is a single, unending state of being. The ground heaves and rolls like a stormy sea. The air, thick with dust and cordite fumes that seep through the cracks, is almost unbreathable. A direct hit on a nearby bunker sends a tremor through the rock that feels as if the entire ridge is collapsing. The men are no longer soldiers. They are animals trapped in a burrow during an earthquake, their training and discipline dissolving into raw, primal terror. Kaito curls into a ball, his hands clasped over his head, his mind retreating to the only place the shells cannot reach. The memory of his mother's face, but even that is being shaken apart by the relentless, all-consuming violence of the typhoon of steel. The American war planners had calculated the tonnage of steel required to destroy fortifications. They had not, and could not, calculate its effect on the human mind. The Japanese defenders were prepared to die, but they were prepared to die in a fight, a contest of wills against another soldier. They were not prepared for this. This was not war. It was extermination by an unseen, omnipotent force. Inside the roaring darkness of Position 73, the psychological collapse began. A young soldier, a boy from Osaka, begins to laugh. It is not a sound of humor, but a high, unhinged shriek of a mind that has broken its moorings. He babbles incoherently about cherry blossoms and festivals, his eyes wide and unseeing. No one tries to silence him. They are all lost in their own private hells. Sergeant Watanabe, the hardened veteran, is curled up in a corner weeping. The stoic mask has crumbled, revealing the terrified man beneath. His experiences in Manchuria were skirmishes, comprehensible struggles of men and rifles. This industrial slaughter has stripped away his years of training and bravado, reducing him to a state of utter helplessness. His authority is gone, evaporated in the concussive waves. The true, unexpected outcome of the bombardment was not just physical destruction, but the systematic dismantling of the Japanese soldier's most formidable weapon, his spirit. The concept of gyokusai, of a noble, honorable death, was predicated on the idea of a meaningful sacrifice. But there was no honor here. There was no glory in being pulverized by a shell fired from a ship you could not see 10 miles away. Men were not killed. They were simply deleted from existence. Bunkers didn't just collapse. They were compressed, the occupants crushed into the earth itself by the unimaginable pressure. The air was sucked from their lungs by passing fireballs. Their eardrums burst. Their internal organs were shredded by pressure waves that passed through the rock as if it were water. Death was arbitrary and impersonal. A man might be standing one moment and the next simply be gone, leaving behind only a dark stain on the wall. This utter powerlessness in the face of annihilation created a new kind of terror. It was a deep existential dread that went beyond the fear of dying. It was the fear of being insignificant, of being erased without a trace by an indifferent machine. For Kaito, The world has become a symphony of sensory torture. The constant, bone-jarring vibration feels as though the rock around them is turning to liquid. The air pressure changes violently with each nearby impact, creating a nauseating pushing and pulling on his body. He is no longer thinking. His consciousness has shrunk to a single pulsing point of terror. The drills, the patriotic songs, the image of the emperor, all of it has been shaken loose, leaving only the fundamental instinct to survive in a world that is actively trying to atomize him. This was the true success of the bombardment. It bypassed the body and attacked the soul, turning disciplined soldiers into cowering, traumatized survivors before they had even seen a single American infantryman. 8:30 hours. The bombardment stops. The sudden absence of sound is a physical blow, more shocking than the noise itself. The transition is so abrupt that for a moment, Kaito believes he has finally gone deaf. The high-pitched whine in his ears is now the loudest thing in the universe. Slowly, other sounds filter through the ringing. The drip of water, the groan of a broken timber, the ragged, painful gasps of his own breathing. A sliver of gray light pierces the darkness. The bunker's entrance, previously a solid wall of earth, has been partially cleared by a near miss. Sergeant Watanabe stirs, his face a pale, mud-streaked mask of shock. He mechanically crawls toward the opening, pushing aside loose rocks. The world he looks out upon is a scene from a nightmare. It is a dead planet, painted in shades of gray and black. Everything is gone. The trees, the grass, the very contours of the hill have been altered. The air is thick with a haze of dust and cordite that stings the eyes and throat. The sky is blotted out by a pall of smoke. Small fires burn everywhere, feeding on shattered roots and buried timbers. It is a primeval landscape, freshly and violently created. Kaito stumbles out after him, his legs unsteady. The change is profound and disorienting. He looks for familiar landmarks and finds none. The gully his machine gun was meant to cover is now a shallow, crater-pocked depression. The neighboring position, home to a mortar team, has vanished. In its place is a crater 30 feet across, its edges glassy from the heat of the explosion. There are no bodies. There is nothing. The psychological impact on the survivors is immediate and devastating. They emerge from their holes like ghosts, their uniforms torn, their faces blackened, many bleeding from the ears and nose. They look at each other with blank, staring eyes. They are in a state of profound shock, a condition modern medicine would call shell shock or combat stress reaction. Their minds, unable to process the sheer scale of the violence they have just endured, have simply shut down. The meticulously planned Japanese defense is in tatters. Communication lines are severed. Command posts have been obliterated. Units are isolated, with no idea if their flanks still exist or if their officers are still alive. The will to fight, so carefully instilled through years of indoctrination, has been replaced by a raw animalistic terror. The Americans are no longer just an enemy army. They are a supernatural force, a vengeful god wielding thunder and earthquakes. How can a man with a rifle stand against a god? For Kaito, the sight of the remade world cements a terrifying new reality. His training, his rifle, his belief in honorable death, all seem like childish fantasies in the face of this. He sees the landing craft approaching the beaches in the distance, tiny specks moving with impunity toward the shore. He knows he should feel hatred, a burning desire for revenge. Instead, he feels nothing but a hollow, empty dread. The battle for Okinawa has just begun, but for many of the Japanese defenders who survived the initial bombardment, the war was already lost. It had been lost in their minds, in the roaring darkness, under the crushing weight of the typhoon of steel. The pre-invasion bombardment of Okinawa, while psychologically devastating, did not annihilate the Japanese 32nd Army. Ushijima's strategy of a defense in depth proved tragically effective. Thousands of his best troops, sheltered in the deepest recesses of the Shuri Line's reverse-slope defenses, survived the initial onslaught. When the American soldiers and Marines pushed inland, they were met with a savage, fanatical resistance from men who had endured hell and emerged from it with a terrifying resolve. The Battle of Okinawa would become the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, a brutal, close-quarters grind through a labyrinth of caves and fortified ridges that would cost the U.S. 10th Army over 49,000 casualties. Yet, the impact of the naval gunfire cannot be understated. It utterly shattered Japan's forward defensive lines, preventing a slaughter on the beaches and allowing the Americans to establish a secure beachhead with relative ease. It obliterated artillery positions, destroyed command and control infrastructure, and inflicted thousands of casualties before the ground battle even began. More importantly, it served as a terrifying preview of the industrial might that Japan was facing. For the Japanese soldiers who survived the barrages, the experience left an indelible scar. The constant threat of the steel rain induced a unique and pervasive form of psychological torture. They called it gunfire morale. Soldiers were forced to live like nocturnal animals, cowering in their caves during the day while the fleet systematically disassembled the island around them, only emerging at night to fight, repair positions, or forage for supplies. The bombardments became a tool of attrition that ground down not only fortifications, but also sanity. The naval bombardments of the Pacific Theater represented the logical apex of conventional warfare in the industrial age. It was the doctrine of overwhelming firepower made manifest, an attempt to use machinery to solve the brutal problem of infantry assault. It showcased America's ability to project power on a scale the world had never seen, turning its economic and manufacturing supremacy into tangible, terrifying kinetic force. This display of power had a profound effect on strategic thinking, both in the United States and among its adversaries. But for the men on the receiving end, huddled in the Okinawan mud, it was not about strategy or doctrine. It was about the primal, visceral terror of being hunted by an enemy you could not see, an enemy who could move mountains and boil the very air. It was the horrifying realization that individual courage, fighting spirit, and loyalty, the core tenets of Bushido, were rendered utterly meaningless in the face of such impersonal, overwhelming violence. It was a lesson written in fire and steel, a message that the age of the samurai was long dead, replaced by the age of the 16-inch shell. The terror felt by men like Kaito Tanaka in the shaking earth of Okinawa was a glimpse into the future of warfare, a future where the battlefield would be dominated not by the bravest soldier, but by the most powerful machine.